Welcome back. We're going to continue on with the themes in the Constitutional Workbook. We're going to proceed with Theme 2, which is Citizens' Rights and Duties, Chapters 2 and 3. And so if you have your workbook in front of you, you'll see that Chapter 2 starts right on the bottom of page 18. And this chapter has 4 articles. Citizenship was a big issue that was discussed numerous times during the Constitutional Convention process, and there were a wide range of opinions on the issue of how to deal with citizenship. Citizenship is fundamentally about the foundation of a nation, and so answering this question for any nation, who are our citizens going to be, what are the regulations going to be, is a big question, and it definitely was in this case as well. And so I'll proceed through and give a little bit of background on what the articles are and a little bit about why, what was decided on this case. So Article 1 basically establishes that citizens of the White Earth Nation shall be descendants of Anishinaabe families. And so this sets out a process of lineal descent or linear descent where it's a perpetual process. There isn't an end date or a cutoff date. What it does is sets into motion a process by which if a person is enrolled and they have a child, that child can be enrolled. In the future, when that child has children, they can be enrolled, and so on. And so it's a perpetual process that continues through descent in families. And linear descent or lineal descent means direct descendancy, so parent to child. Grandparent, child, grandchild, that kind of direction. This sets out that basic fundamental requirement. As Terry mentioned, we saw with the Board of Elections, it sets out a basic premise, and there will have to be policies, procedures, laws that support that. The same thing is true for citizenship. Ultimately, this sets out the base requirement that citizens will be lineal descendants, and they have to be provided documents, genealogical documents, or other agreements or other evidence that's necessary. Ultimately, the Legislative Council will make a policy and a procedure regarding citizenship or enrollment, and that will require documents.
And so that's the kind of process of application, et cetera.
Exactly. Members, anyone who wants to become a member or a citizen. Some people are a little bit more used to the term member. The term member has been used in the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe Constitution. This Constitution uses the term citizen. It's a little more common term when we're dealing with nations to use the term citizen. And so, yes, anyone who wants to become a citizen will have to go through that application process. So it puts the decision point back on individuals, for people who are over 18 and want to decide for themselves whether they want to or don't want to become White Earth citizens if they qualify, or the burden on parents to decide if their children are younger than 18, if they want them to become tribal citizens. And
that process under this Constitution will be developed by the new Legislative Council.
Correct.
Right.
Yep. So this is a different process than the current blood quantum system. Some people are used to the current system. The Minnesota Chippewa Tribe has been using 1/4 blood quantum since the 1960s. And so the delegates talked at length about what that requirement had impacted their families, and both pros and cons on both sides of the issue. And so ultimately what we have here in this proposed constitution is a system of lineal descent. Another issue that came up a bit with citizenship that's often tied to citizenship is entitlements and services. And so that is dealt with in Article 2 of this chapter, which is on page 19. The big question was, if White Earth moves to lineal descent, it's very likely that the population will increase, possibly quite dramatically. And how will that impact services and entitlements? And so Article 2 states that services and entitlements provided by government agencies to citizens will be defined in a wide variety of ways. So some are defined according to treaties. Those treaties don't change. Whatever the parameters are, they are. Other diplomatic agreements, state and federal law, many service and entitlement programs are run especially, as you know, by federal law.
Right.
And so the federal government then sets out the standards in that law as to who can qualify. Not everyone qualifies for every program. There's oftentimes an income requirement to qualify for certain programs. Sometimes there's a residency requirement. Sometimes there's a range of other requirements that are necessary. And so those programs will continue to, those dollars that come through federal law, those laws have to be followed, or those program dollars simply will not continue. So that will be followed. White Earth itself will establish policies and procedures for programs that it runs regarding how to distribute services and entitlements, how are resources going to be managed. There's always a demand for resources, and the question is, how can that be managed with the population? Qualifications will have to be put in place in order to determine, to manage those resources responsibly of who qualifies. There has been some questions about how will this impact federal funding or funding for other programs, and that will vary. Some programs are run on by numbers, a kind of per capita basis, and more citizens might mean more dollars for a program. There are other programs that have a more defined budget, and in that case, that budget will then have to be distributed potentially among more people, and will have to be managed with qualifications, program qualifications, in order to determine who will be served under those programs.
Is there any sense of what impact this will have, this change from quarter degree blunt quantum to lineal descendancies? What sort of numbers are you really looking at here?
There hasn't been an official numbers study done, but many people anticipate that the population would probably quite easily double. There are many families at White Earth that have been impacted by the quarter degree blood quantum and who have family members that are descendants that would likely want to enroll. It's hard to anticipate because, as we talked about, people will have a choice whether they want to become White Earth citizens or not. But it's very likely that the population will grow rapidly, and then it will continue forever. One of the studies that the Minnesota Chippewa tribe recently did looked at blood quantum requirements if they stayed the same in the tribe, and looking at population trends. And that study showed quite clearly that under blood quantum, the population trend is a decreasing population. Ultimately, under lineal descent, the projection would be an increasing population over time. So those are kind of opposing ways of managing population and looking at that fundamental question for White Earth. Who are White Earth citizens? What does that mean to be a White Earth citizen? What should the qualifications be? What's most appropriate for White Earth as a nation?
Yeah. So this is a huge issue, right? This is one of the issues that people are basing their whole decision on about whether to support this Constitution or not. And from our perspective, they're right. You know, this is that big of an issue, and we don't, propose one way or the other. And from your conversations, Jill, what are some of the biggest concerns that people have? What are some of the biggest reasons to support this that people have? Just what you're hearing in the community.
Sure. Yeah, there's a wide range of opinions. I think some of the biggest concerns come from services and entitlements, and a concern that an increased population will result in decreased resources for those people that are currently utilizing resources. Of course, many White Earth citizens are not currently qualified for programs depending on their income and other requirements. But it seems like the big issue is services and entitlement programs for many people. There are other cultural concerns that come up. Citizenship is a political aspect of identity, but each one of us has multifaceted identities. Our personal identity, maybe our professional identity based on our work, maybe an identity based on our family role, etc. And so there's also a question about, what does this political status mean? How does it or doesn't it fit with our traditional values and cultural teachings? How does or doesn't blood quantum fit with our cultural values and traditional teachings? And so people are weighing that out and taking that as part of a consideration as well, thinking about how these things operate on basically a sort of moral level, an ethical level in some ways.
So these are profound issues of identity, of vibrancy, and sustainability of identity in many different ways. You had mentioned a study that MCT produced. Tell us a little bit more about that as just part of the balance of the whole conversation.
Sure. The Minnesota Chippewa tribe has been experiencing a decreasing population, and there's been some questions about how if citizenship were to be changed, how might that change the population? And they were especially interested in looking at including what is commonly called all Indian blood, meaning all blood that the Bureau of Indian Affairs currently recognizes as Indian blood. And when we get into blood quantum, we also have to get into this history a little bit of blood quantum and what is it and what does it mean. And it's, as many people know, something that was created by European Americans and European American scientists thinking about how to measure race, but nation and culture. It kind of got to be a slippery slope between those three things, and ultimately the federal government started using it in some cases to define Indian identity as a way to kind of usurp political status in some ways, or to sometimes limit populations. And so the Minnesota Chippewa tribe ultimately started using the 1/4 Minnesota Chippewa tribe blood quantum requirement in the 1960s. The great urging of the Bureau of Indian Affairs at that time. And it's always been controversial, even ever since then. Some people feeling like that wasn't an appropriate decision, other people saying, well, it's working okay, it's managing our population, maybe it's taken on a meaning of its own that's not a literal meaning as it's meant to be, but maybe some other value for some people. And so that's been going on, but there have been conversations ever since that time about citizenship and blood quantum. And so just within the past year, the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe commissioned Wilder Research Center, which is a research center here in Minnesota, to do a study. And they looked at what would happen if the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe used all Indian blood. As I said, that's federally recognized Indian blood from the Bureau, or all Anishinaabe blood. And in that case, they also counted Canadian blood, or attempted to count that. The Canadian government doesn't have the same tracking system as the US does with blood quantum, but they attempted to include that in their surveys as well.
And then they did a third scenario if it stayed the way it is.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And so ultimately, all of the trends on those were a declining population.
Yeah.
And it looked at about 80 years or so into the future is about how far it went. And White Earth and all of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe nations had a decreasing population under all three of those scenarios, whether it would stay the same 1/4 blood quantum, whether it was all Indian blood, or whether it was all Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Chippewa blood. And so there was a little bit of difference in the numbers, but the ultimate trend was the same towards a decreasing population. In some cases, for some of the tribes, for very minuscule population, under 200.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a very serious consideration as people think about the future. At that meeting, there was definitely references to 7 generations and thinking about planning for children and grandchildren into the future. That's something that people talk about quite a bit when blood quantum comes up.
So those are, just some of the key issues around this issue, which in many ways is one of the more critical aspects of this proposed constitution, responding to population trends that are very real, but also doing in a way that some people are going to support and others are going to oppose, and both of them for very good reasons. So kind of wrap this up, and then let's move on to the rest of this section.
Great. Yep. So there's just 2 other articles in Chapter 2 which allow individuals who are denied citizenship the right of appeal. And then Article 4, which says no person or government has the privilege or power to diminish the sovereignty of the White Earth Nation. And so that's how we see citizenship being dealt with here. As we said, really the two primary articles are Article 1, which says lineal descendancy, which is that perpetual system that's mother or parent to child and so on. And then Article 2, which deals with services and entitlement and managing resources. The next chapter in this theme is Chapter 3, which is rights and duties, and that just continues on pages 19 and 20. You'll see 17 articles here. It's one of the longer chapters in article length anyway. And we have created a chart as well. It may be useful to flip back and forth in your workbook a little bit. Page 4 has a chart with the different rights and that are laid out in Chapter 3. So we have some civil rights, some property rights, and some due process rights. And so you'll see that list is a kind of nice quick reference, but ultimately the best way is to look at the actual chapters and the text of the Constitution. That's what you'll be ultimately voting on, so that's where you want to focus your attention. This is in many ways a kind of Bill of Rights, and you'll notice that Article 17 here notes that in many ways this section is inspired by both inherent and traditional white earth sovereignty, but also by the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968 and the United States Constitution. And so you'll definitely see some similarities here with some of the rights that we see in the Indian Civil Rights Act and the United States Constitution. So things like Article 1, which says the White Earth Nations shall make no laws that will establish a religion or laws that deny free expression of religion, speech, or press, and electronic communication. Electronic communication is a little bit newer, as this was written in 2007 through 9. But we see this fundamental principle here, again, outlining fundamental principles. There will have to be laws and processes and procedures, and probably challenges in this case, as Terry mentioned, the Chapter 4 that deals with sovereign immunity. In many ways, if a citizen feels like their rights, any of their rights of the Constitution, but especially those in Chapter 3, have been violated, then they can take recourse within the judicial system. And so this sets out the basic fundamentals of freedom of speech, freedom to gather peaceably for any reason. Every time we present this, groups come up with a different one that they think is of interest to them. So we see Article 4, lots of provisions that says that people are equal under the law, that the government can't practice discrimination because of political, economic, social, or cultural associations, because of race, creed, sex, gender, disability, social status. That's an important thing for many people. Freedom of expression has come up on a number of occasions, and freedom of speech in our discussions, and this Constitution very clearly protects those rights. No censorship relates to that. That's Chapter 6. That kind of coincides with freedom of speech. That also protects secrecy of personal communication. Other points of interest here have been some of the due process rights, which we see guaranteed. Articles 8, 9 deal with some of that. Article 10 deals with firearms. People shall have the right to possess firearms except for convicted felons in accordance with state and federal law. And this has come up on a number of occasions because we see state and federal law referenced, which we don't see many direct references to at all in this Constitution. And so naturally the White Earth Nation will make its own laws in a variety of capacities. But this Constitution says when it comes to firearms, the White Earth Nation is going to follow state and federal law. And so that's a kind of unique exception to many of the other provisions in the Constitution and the way that White Earth will make its own law. Other things that are of interest, Article 13 deals with double jeopardy, essentially. No person shall be subject to trial twice for the same indictment or offense. This needs a little point of clarification because what that means is within the wider court system, no person will be tried twice for the same offense. That doesn't mean that another jurisdiction, White Earth doesn't have control necessarily over who state or federal courts may be prosecuting. And so this doesn't deal with that. This deals with prosecution within White Earth court system. It doesn't deal with other court systems. Article 16 has also been a point of interest that citizens shall never be banished from the White Earth Nation. Definitely pro and con on both sides of this one. Some people feeling that banishment is a great tool for punishing individuals who have committed crimes. Other people feeling that banishment violates fundamental human rights, pointing to evidence as well of some tribal nations who have in recent years used banishment as a very strong political tool to eliminate political opponents and eliminate the rights. By banishing somebody, you eliminate their voting rights, you eliminate their services and entitlements,
Right.
that type of thing. So that's a unique provision that has come up.
It's important to point out that a lot of the language in this chapter 3 is fairly broad. And if you look at any constitution, U.S. Constitution, etc., it has very broad language, like in Article 1, White Earth shall make no laws that would establish a religion or laws that would deny free expression of religion, speech, or of the press and electronic communication, right? So 4 distinct rights that are established in that very brief sentence. And each one of these need to be developed.
Yep.
You know, we can have a conversation here about what it says, but what it fully means in practice is a process of governance and the courts. And we'll talk later in the second half of this session about the independent judiciary, the rights and authorities, how the White Earth courts that are established under this Constitution have the right and the authority to interpret this Constitution. And so that process of kind of coming to a conclusion about what these words mean in a very practical and day-to-day purposes here on White Earth is a part of process that the White Earth courts will interpret, the White Earth Legislative Council will interpret, and members or citizens of the White Earth Nation will interpret. Because as the government does something or individual does something, there will be conflict often.
Yeah.
And those conflicts will be then brought to the White Earth courts or will be resolved on their own. And it's that process of actually living here on White Earth and living this Constitution that will fill out the details of what all of this language means.
Yeah.
Okay?
All right.
So we'll take a brief pause here and then move on to the next section.